Okay, hello everyone. My name is Rohan Stevenson. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki, and today I'll be presenting a research project I carried out entitled Returning to Nature, the Imaginative Geographies and Histories of the Folkish Far Right. Now, as I'm sure many of you will already know, in March 2019, this man went into a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, and shot and killed 51 worshippers. He live streamed the attack online, where he also published a manifesto called The Great Replacement, in which he described himself as an eco-fascist, referring to an ideology that combines ecologism and environmentalism with white supremacy, and in which he argued that green nationalism is the only true nationalism. The Christchurch attacker argued that the natural environment was being destroyed by mass immigration and uncontrolled urbanization, and that therefore, in order to save our natural environment, these foreign invaders must be killed. Now, the Christchurch attacker appears to have been radicalized online. And indeed, eco-fascist ideologues are increasingly sharing ideas and forming communities on social media platforms such as Telegram, where they refer to themselves as folkish, a term which has an interesting history, which I'll explain in a sec. But firstly, a couple of words on Telegram. So Telegram is a kind of privacy-focused instant messaging platform, which has become popular with the far right in recent years because of its avoidance of politically motivated censorship and its use of end-to-end encryption. And one of Telegram's unique features is what are called public channels, whereby single users can kind of set up these channels where they communicate unidirectionally with an unlimited number of subscribers. And this feature basically allows, well, anyone really, to set up what are effectively their own unofficial media platforms where they share memes, videos, audio files, pictures, and text. So on the right here, you can see a small snapshot of just some of the folkish Telegram channels out there, which are kind of grouped by ideological themes, as you can see here. But yeah, now a few words on this word folkish. It's a direct translation from the German word folkish, which is the name of a movement which originated in the late 19th century in Germany under the influence of Romanticism. Now, folkish ideology was basically centered around the idea that much like plants and animals, humans are kind of naturally rooted in particular ecosystems and preformed by their racial and geographical origins. And this is where we first see the idea of blood and soil, which kind of denotes this sacred relationship between humans, blood, and the land, soil. Of course, the idea that some human communities are kind of belong in or are rooted in specific landscapes is inevitably accompanied by the idea that others don't. And it's there that we see the beginnings of the idea of kind of invasive species and invaders that the Christchurch attacker referred to in his manifesto. Folkish thought was kind of built on three ideological pillars. So the first was anti-modernity, which was seen to be modernity was seen to be kind of uprooting the folk from their native lands through the processes of industrialization and urbanization. Secondly, we see ethnocentric populism. So modernity was seen to be kind of imposed from above onto the native German people by a kind of corrupt Jewish elite. And thirdly, we see strands of eco-mysticism. So this blood and soil idea was kind of seen as a kind of sacred and spiritual and even mystical relationship between humans and the land. Folkish ideology can also be described as what Paul Monaco calls reactionary consciousness. And I'll read this quote from him since he describes it better than I ever could. So Monaco argues that in seeking to ameliorate the condition of spiritual and emotional impoverishment brought on by modern life in industrial societies, reactionary consciousness marks an atavistic flight from nearly any aspect of experience that may be called modern. In this flight, the pursuit of a return to nature, or the embrace of instinct over reason, or the quest to recognize links between people that are racial rather than historical, are common. And here on the right, you can see the logo of the Nazi regime's Ministry of Food and Agriculture, which has the words blood and soil, Blut und Boden in German. Okay, so that was a bit of background to the kind of to the folkish movement. And as I'll now demonstrate through my research, these ideas are still very much alive, albeit with a kind of contemporary interpretation in the world of folkish online communities. Okay, so for my research, I spent 6 months participating as a covert observer in a number of folkish Telegram channels. So on the right here, you can see what my Telegram feed looked like during that time. And for my analysis, I eventually chose just a single folkish Telegram channel called Returning to Nature, which is highlighted here. And this channel was run by a Finnish Telegram user whose username was Raaka-liha, which means raw meat. And I chose this channel because I felt that it best characterized kind of contemporary folkish ideas. However, it's also worth mentioning that because of the kind of snowball effect of Telegram, whereby channels repost content from other channels, I still ended up working with data from kind of the broader folkish milieu in general. In terms of methodology, I conducted a discourse analysis in the tradition of Michel Foucault, which basically involved coding the Returning to Nature channel for key tropes, claims to truth, and also silences, so what is left unsaid. And I used as a kind of theoretical framework the ideas of Edward Said, particularly his notion of imaginative geography and history. Now, Said describes imaginative geography and history as the kind of process of inventing or imagining geographical spaces and historical periods that pay little attention to the actuality of what these spaces and periods are or were actually like. Now, this doesn't mean that they're completely made up, but just that they may be very kind of selective or simplistic in what they choose to represent. Now, the purpose of imaginative geography and history is to help the mind to intensify its own sense of itself by dramatizing the distance and difference between what is close to it and what is far away. And this is because societies, as Said argues, often derive a sense of their identity negatively, or in other words, they define themselves as much by what they are not as what they are. Now, Said used this idea to describe the ways in which the West kind of has historically derived its identity in opposition to kind of so-called Oriental cultures. But I also found it to be a really useful idea for examining folkish far-right discourses. Okay, so I'll now move on to outlining the kind of key findings from my research using some of the visual data that I gathered from the Returning to Nature Telegram channel. So my first finding was that folkish discourse appears to kind of construct an imaginative geography between rural against urban. So what I found was that representations of both of these landscapes are highly selective. So as we can see here, the rural is kind of represented through depopulated wildernesses like this forest scene, or then kind of white heteronormative agricultural scenes. And then in contrast, we've got the urban, which is represented in a way that kind of emphasizes the vastness and anonymity of big cities. So we see scenes like, kind of huge traffic jams, for example. And this is obviously a kind of very simplified imaginative geography where you have two kind of extremes and in which there's no middle ground. Now, onto this imaginative geography is mapped a kind of a very binary ontology in which the rural is associated with being natural and is associated with authenticity. And in that sense, returning to nature is not only returning to kind of nature as a geographical space, it's also returning to your natural state. And this can be seen as a kind of ecological take on the red pill idea, which is common in far right thought more broadly, and which basically refers to the movie The Matrix, in which Neo takes a red pill, which helps him to see true reality, which is also alluded to here. Um, this is quite ironic though, since representations of the rural are often actually taken from movies and video games. So, for example, in the previous slide, this kind of wilderness forest scene is actually a screenshot from the Disney movie Maleficent. So it's quite literally an imagined geographical landscape. Um, so in contrast to that kind of natural rural landscape, we see that the urban is associated with inauthenticity. So it's artificial, it's unnatural, and it's false. Furthermore, we see that while the rural is associated with purity, the urban is often associated with pollution. So here we have cities described as unnatural cesspools, and a cesspool is like a place where you keep sewage and shit, basically. But interestingly, and this is kind of common to far right thought more broadly, we see physical pollution drawn together with moral and social pollution. So in this image, for example, we've got the kind of physical pollution represented by the pile of trash, but then that's also drawn together with the kind of moral and social pollution of this film store selling pornography. And again, this image is actually from a film set, from a TV show. So it's quite literally an imagined geographical landscape. Okay, so if returning to nature is also returning to our natural state, what exactly is this natural state? Well, it's here that we see the construction of a kind of imaginative history in which the natural state or traditional way of life of the folk is seen to have been replaced by modernity, consumerism, and domestication. So the natural state of the folk is primarily expressed in social Darwinist terms. It's survival of the fittest. So humans are depicted as just another animal in the kind of battle for survival. Once again, this is a highly selective view of nature, so it emphasizes violence and competition and tends to invisibilize aspects of nature such as cooperation and mutual aid. An example of this is that all the animals that appear on folkish channels are pretty much always bears and wolves, so kind of predators. Yeah, and in contrast to this, we see that modernity is represented as a slave-like zoo, where the kind of natural, violent, and competitive instincts of the folk are being smothered and suppressed through domestication and transhumanization. And notice also how this kind of this metaphor, this image of the zoo, functions as a kind of ecological metaphor for populism. So the human animals, aka the people, the folk, are kind of being herded into the zoos by this corrupt elite. Now, onto this imaginative history is mapped, again, a kind of very binary epistemology, which positions the higher wisdom of natural law against the kind of falseness of modern day science. So in the previous slide, we saw, I don't know if you can see this because of the Zoom thing, but see if I can move it. Yeah, so like this caption, survival is the highest law. And so here in the next slide, we see that this natural law is argued to be objective, and it's true. In contrast, modern day science is seen to be manipulated by politicians who are peddling misinformation. And again, we see this kind of uniquely ecological take on populism, whereby the elite are seen to be kind of going against the laws of nature through their kind of false misinformation. So to round up, these ideas that we've seen so far, the kind of imaginative geographies and histories, and then these like binary ontologies and epistemologies that are mapped onto them, function to justify a kind of folkish ethical code, which is summarized by the phrase, might is right. So here's a post from the Returning to Nature channel in which the channel creator asks, is it cruel to slay an animal so your family, children specifically, may get adequate nutrition and develop to their full potential? Is it cruel to your tribe, your kin, that you slay down a member of another race, trying to rape your women, pillage your homes, and conquer your lands? What decides these outcomes? Might. Thus, might is right. So since might determines the outcome of the battle for survival, since it's kind of this natural law, it's by extension seen to be the way that things should be. It's kind of an ethical code. Um, and with that in mind, it's perhaps unsurprising that the Christchurch attacker felt that the murder of 51 Muslim worshippers was kind of the correct and right course of action for him. So in conclusion, I'd like to suggest a couple of things that we can learn from the study of the folkish far right. So the first is what I would argue to be the danger of striving for environmental justice without social justice. So as we know, this conference is inviting us to consider the challenges in forming and maintaining socially and ecologically sustainable societies. And I would argue that one such challenge is posed by those members of our society, such as the Christchurch attacker, who would want to protect the environment at the expense of marginalized people. So to counter these actions, I believe that we must hold social justice, and that includes justice for all minorities, gender minorities, racial minorities, etc., at the heart of our environmental justice campaigning. But beyond this, I think there's also something to be learned about our ways of thinking more broadly. So as I've hopefully demonstrated, folkish and eco-fascist thought is centered around these kind of very simplistic binaries and absolutes. So we've got rural versus urban, natural versus unnatural, true versus false, and right versus wrong. And these binaries necessarily exclude. So I would argue that if we can try to adopt more holistic ways of thinking, which complex the kind of complex and messy reality of the world that we live in, perhaps we can build futures that are more inclusive, sustainable, and just. And thirdly, I want to also point us to what I would argue is the danger of using nature as a guide for human action, since this kind of invariably involves projecting our understandings of human society onto nature and then using nature to justify those social assumptions, which, as we can see in the case of folkish ideology, very quickly has very violent implications. And to finish off, I'd like to leave us, or leave you, or leave everyone with this quote from the environmental historian William Cronin, um, from his wonderful article entitled "The Trouble with Wilderness," which has served as a real kind of guiding light for me when I've been thinking about these issues. And Cronin writes that learning to honor the wild, learning to remember and acknowledge the autonomy of the other, means striving for critical self-consciousness in all of our actions. It means never imagining that we can flee into a mythical wilderness to escape history and the obligation to take responsibility for our own actions that history inescapably entails. If wildness can stop being just out there and start being also in here, if it can start being as humane as it is natural, then perhaps we can get on with the unending task of struggling to live rightly in the world, not just in the garden, not just in the wilderness, but in the home that encompasses them both. Thank you very much.